flip that open. It should work fine.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all this morning, bright and early. So today we're going to be talking about the anti-DEI legislation that's been happening in this country and how it's affecting academic emergency medicine. The title of our presentation is Shh, Don't Say DEI. So our speakers are...
I'm Cortland. I'm at Carolinas.
Utah, Stanford.
Manning, Parkland, UT Southwest.
Hi, I'm Dahlia Oda. I'm from Henry Ford Hospital.
And I'm Valerie Pierre from the University of Maryland.
And I'm Kristen Smith from the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania.
So for our outline, we'll be talking about the case for DEI in medicine and why it's important, the impact of the SCOTUS repeal that was done in 2023 on underrepresented minorities in medicine, the current anti-DEI legislation, legal challenges to the anti-DEI legislation, current institutional responses, and an open forum. So by the end of this talk, you should be able to outline the origins of the anti-DEI movement in this country and its impact on residency programs, as well as be able to discuss strategies used by residencies that have successfully maintained or expanded their DEI efforts. You should be able to discuss approaches to creating psychologically safe spaces for trainees to discuss DEI concerns. And we'll have an open forum at the end where we can discuss collaborative ways to mitigate what's happening right now.
Okay, thank you all for joining. I'm gonna come over here. So I just wanna make a really quick case for DEI in medicine to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page. First, I wanna talk about patient outcomes. So it's known that whenever you have a patient and a provider and they look similar or they share an identity characteristic, something really powerful happens. And that's that trust increases. With that trust comes actual behavioral changes. So patients are more likely to follow up for their routine visits. They're more likely to seek preventative care. And they're more likely to actually stick to the treatment plan. And it's not just about these behavioral changes, it's literally about survival. So Black newborns are more than twice as likely to survive whenever they're cared for by a Black physician. It also increases lifespan. So in counties where there are more Black physicians, Black residents live longer. Also, let's talk about where these minority physicians are actually practicing. So a lot of minority physicians practice in our communities and our neighborhoods that are the most underserved in terms of their medical needs. So we're not just diversifying the face of medicine, we're really filling those core needs that our society has in terms of their healthcare. And then let's just go into science. Numerous studies have shown that whenever you have more diversity on your research team, your impact is better, your productivity is better. You're able to publish in higher impact journals. It actually influences patients more. So patient outcomes, racial concordance saves lives, minoritized physicians fill critical gaps, and diverse teams lead to better science, which leads to better medicine. Let's go into the numbers a little bit. So on the left, you have a pie chart of the US population, and it's broken down by race ethnicity. On the right, you have practicing physicians, and this is from the 2022 AAMC data. You can see in the yellow, that's our Black population, so 14% of the US population, 6% practicing physicians. Let's talk about Hispanic, 19% US population, 7% practicing physicians. Let's talk about Asians, they're in that kind of gray. 6% US population, 21% practicing physicians. Well, that sounds great, but there's so many disparities, particularly as it relates to Asian American physicians when it comes to leadership positions, particularly in academic medicine. Let's break down these numbers a little bit further and go into the Black population kind of as a case study. So this is data of over 150,000 physicians, and it's data that's collected from 1990s, real long time ago, to 2018. You can see on the top in the blue is percent of the total population that's Black, and then in the orange, next is percent of physicians Black. Let's just take out the middle of the chart, just to kind of give us a better sense of literally comparing 2010 and 2018 to 1930. So percent of total population Black decreased and then went back up. So we're kind of where we started in 1900. Percent of physician Black in the orange, great, increase. But if you look at where that increase happened, it is largely carried by Black women. So the gray line is Black men. Literally, we are at the same percent of Black male physicians as we were in 1930. That is insane. So yes, we've made progress, but it's largely driven by Black women entering medicine here. Now let's just talk about the impact of DEI programs, and we'll just talk about med school at first. So it is known that at med schools where they have more DEI programming, that the student body is more diverse. We already showed diverse student body, diverse physicians, better patient outcomes, better science. But it's not just about those minority physicians and minority patients. So numerous studies have shown, and this is just an excerpt from one, that whenever you have a diverse medical student body, cultural mobility is increased, patient outcomes increase. In fact, white students said that the more diverse their student body was, the more comfortable they felt taking care of all patients from different backgrounds. So again, it's not just about minority physicians, minority patients. This is about training all doctors and all providers to take care of all patients. Then let's go into retention and burnout. We are currently facing a healthcare workforce crisis, and dismantling DEI has just made that even worse. It's known that at these large institutions that are considered not inclusive, and there's multiple criteria for this, physicians are more than twice as likely to think about leaving. So we really can't afford this. We can't afford this in terms of just patient outcomes, and we can't afford it in terms of finances. It can take up to $500,000 to recruit one physician. We literally cannot afford that. In addition to that, healthcare disparities cost over $5 billion each year. So we need to focus on this. I'm going to transition over to Kristen. She's going to talk about the history of affirmative action.
So thank you, Cortland, for kind of that introduction. We are going to now transition into speaking a little bit about affirmative action, and I think it's important for all of us to kind of review some of the landmark legal cases in relation to affirmative action before we get started in more specifics. So as defined by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, affirmative action is really any measure adopted to correct or to prevent in the future discrimination from any type of cause. And so there has really been 4 large landmark cases that have really been crucial in affirmative action related to equitable access to education in this country. So the first being Brown versus the Board of Education. In 1954, which actually ruled that the doctrine at the time, separate but equal, was unconstitutional, and it ruled that segregation in public schools was not constitutional, right? So it overturned the doctrine of the time, which was separate but equal, which had been established by Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. The next is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is a federal law that prohibits discrimination in employment based on color, race, sex, national origin, or creed. The next one was, was Regents versus Bakey in 1978, which ruled that admissions could not use race as a sole factor. So it got rid of racial quotas. It said that that was unconstitutional when it came to admissions, especially related to medical school. So what happened in that case is that a student named Alan Bakey in 1978, he was a white male student who had applied to UC Davis for medical school admission, and he was denied. And it was deemed that the admissions policies of the university were unconstitutional because they actually held a certain number of slots for non-white applicants. So although that court case did rule that it was unconstitutional to have racial quotas in admissions, it did rule that it was constitutional to include race as one piece of an admissions decision in a holistic review. And that was upheld again in Grutter versus Bollinger in 2003, which was the Supreme Court case which upheld the University of Michigan Law School's use of race as a factor in admissions to ensure diversity of its class.
So 11 years after that last decision, what you start to see is smaller groups forming and filing complaints against different institutions. In this case, you have 2 complaints specifically against Harvard and UNC that say that they discriminated against white and Asian students on the basis of race. And 2015 and 2019, this consistently goes through circuit courts, escalating, ultimately, and it reaches the level of the Supreme Court, where they side with the institutions. But then, well, before the first pass, it sides with the institution. But then in June 2023, we get this windfall decision of 6-3, where they find that this is essentially unconstitutional, striking down affirmative action pretty broadly. And it's important to note that in reading the different opinions, there's some language that signals the direction of this conversation, right? One of the main things is that Justice Roberts talks about some of the aims and the goals initially of affirmative action being too broad and hard to measure and track, and whether or not it's actually promoting the training of future leaders, and can you sufficiently judge whether or not this is met simply by allowing different races to be, I guess, more equitably distributed among these classes. Then it brings up this conversation of the use of race in a negative manner. And I thought this is very interesting, right, where they say that race can't be used as somewhat of a demerit. It should be considered as something that helps bolster an applicant broadly. So that language is very key. But let it be noted that also Justice Ketanji Brown wrote in her opinion that she thinks that this had broad-reaching effects and could potentially be very disheartening to see in its play out in the education systems. We see various types of effects from that point forward. The proximal effects and the ones that happen a little bit more long-term. And so based upon proximity, sometimes these effects are hard to tease out. The initial ones we all felt and saw. This is policy change. Immediately it felt like mission statements started to shift. You saw the different language being used or signaling changing, meaning like if they were initially making language that showed that there was an idea of equity around races, they changed those policies a little bit. Holistic review was in favor, but then programs started changing race as a metric, or thinking about this and using things like distance traveled or their broad struggle instead of explicitly saying ethnic minorities. In the first admission cycle, there's some differing data, right? And this is looking at undergraduate medical education admissions as somewhat of a proxy measure for how the immediate impact was felt. In some institutions, you would see a shift or change in the ethnic minorities, particularly Black and brown applicants started to change. But then in others, they saw a rise. And it couldn't really be teased out what was at the root of this. And so the thought is that this is still too close to really measure and gauge the immediate impact on terms of matriculation into undergraduate education. But when you look at medical school applications, this tells a very different story. This story shows that in that one cycle right after the decision, you see essentially an 11% decrease in Black and brown matriculants, despite seeing a rise in applicants. And so it tells a very different narrative when you think about the increased, there's no like wane in interest in becoming a physician, but because of this particular policy and the downstream repercussions of the policy, now you start to see some dwindling numbers in people who are actually accepted. One of the bigger concerns in the long term is whether or not this legal precedence is going to have sweeping effects. And I think that it creates part of the groundswell for anti-DEI conversations. There's significant defunding that we started to see as a result that are supported by this legal precedent. Then there are the optics of what I call the optics of homogeneity. So what does it mean to have a less inclusive learning environment? How does that look? How does that affect the classroom? But more importantly, how does the de-emphasis on social and structural drivers or factors that affect our health outcomes by virtue of having these diverse classrooms affect patient care, affect the outcomes themselves? We're also starting to see that URM applicants are pivoting. They're pivoting in a variety of different ways. One way is they're pivoting away from majority institutions, places where they may not feel as welcome or feel like these policies are protective at all. They're pivoting towards institutions that preserve their commitments to DEI or that preserve the idea of having diverse candidate bases, diverse student populations, and increasing their psychological safety in those spaces. And they're also pivoting towards institutions that have a large URM leadership presence at any level, because that mentorship thread is also significantly related to their long-term trajectory. So all of these different pivots, I mean, I just saw this week that several institutions are having, student groups that are supporting their own different celebrations for graduation now. And this is unfortunately a byproduct, again, of some of these policies coming downstream. I'm going to pass this over to our next speaker. Right on over.
So since 2023, there has really been a surge in anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion legislation that has been proposed, with several actually becoming law. So for instance, the state medical board accreditation requirements are under scrutiny in California, because California currently has AB 241, which is a requirement that all physicians, in order to be recertified every 2 years, have to undergo 1 single hour of implicit bias training. However, a group of doctors and also the nonprofit Do No Harm, which was founded in North Carolina, are actually suing the California Medical Board to get that requirement removed. Also, state medical board diversity is being contested as well. So there are currently lawsuits against the Tennessee and Louisiana state medical boards, which are challenging the legality of policies to ensure representation. So these boards specifically have policies that their board needs to be made up of diverse individuals that better reflects the communities that they serve. However, that is being contested as well. So I think you all probably remember the Educate Act, which was proposed in March of last year. So it is titled the Embracing Anti-Discrimination, Unbiased Curricula and Advancing Truth in Education, Educate Bill, which was proposed by North Carolina Congressman and a urologist, Dr. Greg Murphy, in March of last year. So the bill proposes to amend the Higher Education Act of 1965 to cut off federal funding to medical schools if they adopt policies related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this bill also recommends that we limit the discussion of systemic inequities related to healthcare in our curricula, and also wants to decommission any diversity offices that medical schools may have. And while that particular bill was not actually passed as of yet, we all know that several of the current executive orders that have been coming out of the White House are very much in line with the act, maybe more extreme than the act, some would say, and have recently been introduced that has really put into motion the decommissioning of diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, offices within medical schools and residency programs. Most recently, on April 23rd, so just a few weeks ago, a executive order came out calling for the Liaison Committee of Medical Education, the LCME, and Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, ACGME, to remove DEI-related accreditation standards. The order also calls for the Secretary of Education to take a look into these accreditation bodies if they do not comply. And so they could remove funding and also remove their ability to even accredit medical schools and residency programs. And although I don't have the slide in here because it's so new, but on March 9th, so literally just a few days ago, the ACGME basically said that it is suspending its enforcement of any of its accreditation policies related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and that they will be reviewing that at an upcoming meeting and deciding if they will move forward with requiring programs to have to put into place these initiatives or not. So this has already actually affected how we are going to be teaching our students and our residents.
All right, so I'm going to talk about what's going on at the court level of things. Dr. Brown ×2 and Dr. Smith here have talked about things that are happening at the state level and what's happening in Congress a little bit, but I'm just going to specifically be focusing on what's going on in the courts and the challenges that are being made against these executive orders. So there are 2 executive orders and 2 really large challenges that I'm going to be discussing here. But first I wanted to start with how legal challenges move in the courts, because I think when you kind of understand this, you kind of know where we're going with the cases that I'll mention. And I know for me, when I'm thinking about these cases, I'm like, all right, so what's next? When are we going to get to the Supreme Court level of things? What are we doing right now? And so first, we start with the federal district court, and this is where a case is filed. The case is heard, and ultimately a judge decides whether the executive order is legal or not. And so during this time, they may issue a preliminary injunction to pause enforcement of the executive order. And it kind of becomes this ping pong game where they, file a preliminary injunction, they remove it back and forth. And so this actually actively happens both at this phase and this next phase. How we move from the federal district court to the circuit court of appeals is, either plaintiff or defendant doesn't like the outcome of, what the judge has decided for the federal district court case, and so they'll bring it up to the circuit court of appeals. And so they'll review the district court decision. No new evidence is usually presented at this time. They really just really try to focus on whether the law was applied correctly or not. And there's a panel of 3 judges who issue a decision and whether to uphold, reverse, or modify. And once again, like I said, this preliminary injunction or temporary restriction orders happen during this phase as well. And then lastly, if there are Circuit Court of Appeals decisions that differ throughout the country, then, and the U.S. Supreme Court is interested in hearing about this case, and they think that this might be of national importance, they'll decide to hear about this. And they ultimately, of course, issue a final ruling on whether the executive order is constitutional and set precedent for this country on this topic. There are 2 cases. I'm going to go through 2 legal challenges in the next 2 slides, but this one I just wanted to show. These are the 2 cases. The first one you'll see is in the Circuit Court of Appeals in the 4th District currently, and then the second case is still in the Federal District Court. So we're still kind of not anywhere near the Supreme Court level of things just yet, but kind of inching our way there. The first case I'm going to talk about is the NADOHE versus Trump, and what that stands for is the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education. And there's, I say others, there's also the American Association of University Professors in the city of Baltimore as well, who are named plaintiffs. And what they're arguing are that there are violations of the First Amendment, restricting free speech and academic freedom, specifically when it comes to topics about systemic racism, implicit bias, health equity, or equity at large. And then they also argue on constitutional vagueness, so using terms like divisive concepts that are open to interpretation, and so could be enforced very arbitrarily. And so, like I said, currently in the Circuit Court of Appeals, there was an injunction that initially the executive order was not to be enforced, but that was actually reversed more recently in March of 2025. So to be clear, enforcement of the executive order in this jurisdiction currently exists. The next case I'm going to talk about is the NAACP versus Department of Education. This case is still relatively, it's newer. I should say the past case is more of the case when people are referencing the legal challenges, and this is a relatively newer one. But this one is in the DC District Court. And what they're arguing are violations of equal protection clauses and violations of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act that are somewhat related, but essentially what they're saying is that banning DEI programs disproportionately harms students of color and violates anti-discrimination protections for federally funded programs. And so as of April 24th, 2025, so this is relatively new, there's a preliminary injunction against the executive order, so it is to not be enforced in this. And so you're seeing already kind of this differing decision between this case and that last one, but they're at different levels of courts. And so current enforcement and risks. So what's happening now? Federal agencies are actively investigating and penalizing institutions that violate anti-discrimination laws or operate non-compliant DEI programs, however they see fit. Penalties can vary. They can be fines, they could be administrative sanctions, they can be exclusion from federal programs and federal funding, of course. The legal risks, there's the False Claims Act. Liability is now being used to target organizations that falsely certify compliance with federal anti-discrimination laws while operating DEI programs and may be considered unlawful under the recent EOs. And then, of course, there's loss of a potential loss of NIH and NSF funding, and it can for non-compliant programs. We've already seen DEI-related research either, have threatened to remove funding or have actually, in this week, I feel like I've talked to a few people who have had their funding unfortunately removed or pulled. And so all this creates significant legal and financial risk for institutions, but more importantly, it really impacts people, real-life people in all of this. And so what's next? We have to continue to let this play out in the courts. These lawsuits are ongoing and outcomes are still very uncertain. We're relatively in the earlier phases of things, but already seeing the injunctions back and forth, whether we're enforcing the EOs or not, tells us that most likely this probably will lead to differing results in the Circuit Court of Appeals and will probably be heard in the Supreme Court. Some legal scholars think that this might happen as early as late 2025 or early 2026. And then legislative action. So like I said, I was focusing more on the courts of things, but things can happen in other avenues, whether states are proposing bills or what have you. And there's the DEI Protection Act that is an example of that. And then in the meantime, institutional changes. So many organizations are pausing or scaling back or doing away with their DEI initiatives, I think like Dr. Brown mentioned earlier, to avoid legal and financial risks. And federal agencies have increased compliance reviews, and the threat of losing federal funding is obviously very real. And then the impact, of course, on diversity and research, like the research that was shown earlier here that shows it's already somewhat affecting matriculation at the undergraduate level, but really matriculation admissions at the medical student level already. And then the loss of research funding threatens progress, especially in the space of health equity, and raises concerns about what disparities work will look like and disparities that patients face moving forward. All right.
All right. So we have talked about things from the federal level. We've also talked about what has gone on in terms of the courts. Now let's look at what's going on in the states. And then at the end, we're going to end up talking a little bit about what are we going to be doing about all of these things. So how many of you live in a state where a DEI ban is currently in place? Yeah, so it's definitely affecting many of us here. So, and this, I will warn you all, it's so fluid. We've given this different iterations of this lecture, and each time I have to increase the number. But at this point, we're at 127 bills had been introduced. We had 17 that had final legislative approval, 16 had become law. And the only bright side is that 73 of them had been tabled for one reason or another. Many of these states that some of you all live in include Florida, Texas. Florida had two, so they were like, founding fathers of all of this. Texas, North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, Alabama, Idaho, West Virginia, North Carolina, Wyoming, Arkansas, and Ohio. Now, we're going to talk about these rules in the general sense, and then we're going to do a case study of one of these states. So in the general sense, they said there should be no influence of sex, race, gender, or sexual orientation in hiring decisions. There should be no preferential treatment given based on the above for grants, scholarships, and financial aid. There should be no political tests or mandatory diversity statements. I say mandatory. No teaching or counseling based on DEI principles, and no funding for DEI offices or leadership positions. So, general. Now let's talk specifically about Texas, which I'm biased because I also live and work in, but it gives kind of like an understanding of what kind of rulings are occurring in other states. So it's SB 17, came in, it was passed in 2023, gave us a few months in order to start working on it for it to go into compliance for January 1st of 2024. So far we've been under this for a year and some. And the general principle was to prohibit public universities, colleges in Texas from establishing or maintaining a DEI office or initiative. Now, public universities, which universities that are funded. So private universities, we're not under this, but we're going to talk a little bit about how this overcompliance issues then started affecting a lot of the private institutions. So what specifically does the Texas rule ban? DEI and LGBTQIA plus offices in positions and programs. Solicitation of DEI statements, mandatory DEI diversity training, and any kind of preference based on sex, race, or ethnicity. And it required the policies for disciplining people who do not do this. Some of it includes putting people on websites and saying, hey, this person they just changed their name. They didn't actually change what their activities are. The other and the most pertinent one is restricting funding, especially since you're a public university dependent on the state to fund you for various research and whatever. They restrict funding, and you have to have a yearly certification of compliance. Now, the reason I want to specify what it does not ban is because there's been a lot of overcompliance that's occurred, and it becomes helpful for us to have an understanding of what is allowed and what is not allowed in order to make decisions about how we move forward. So academic course instructions, i.e. we can have this lecture in your school if you're in Texas, Ohio, Wyoming, or any of those places. Scholarly activity for faculty or students. Activities by recognized student groups. Remember, no more DEI offices, but unfortunately, that burden has now been passed to the student groups. Now, many of you have heard of what the minority tax is, which is where there's an expectation of people who are underrepresented to actually spearhead some of these initiatives that are required for making the environment inclusive for all. However, this is not paid. This has taken up a lot of their time, and that time is no longer available to be used for other more productive, other productive things for them to use, right? So it becomes very problematic. Now, if you're expecting student organizations to, like Dr. Brown had talked about earlier, to sponsor events like welcome in new students of a certain race or a certain thing, then they have to solicit funds, they have to do the planning. Those are times that they can't use to study for step 3 or study for any other exam that people just took. And And then if they don't do well, they become doubly punished because, well, you should have focused on your studies. But then you want to create an environment for everyone. So that becomes problematic. Guest speakers, so you can have guest speakers or performance. And then they have this thing, student recruitment. So what they mean is we can still go to like SNMA, LMSA, but there's that restriction on providing financial incentives for people to come in. So like if you used to, many of us have these rotations for people who are underrepresented, and that becomes difficult to fund them to come in because that goes under the funding thing that was problematic. So what happened in Texas, for example? Then they fired a bunch of people, which was expected. Bless you. They changed the names of various centers. So Multicultural Center became the Multicultural and Community Engagement and Success Initiatives. They changed a lot of the websites. They scrubbed the websites of even faculty, changing a lot of things that mentioned or referenced DEI. And then a lot of student groups were now spending time organizing events that were normally supposed to be organized by the centers, and that became undue burden on the students. So Texas became very problematic in that sense. What about universities in general? So many of you have heard about the Harvard situation, and for a quick review, there was, with the initial executive order, there was negotiations, there was a task force that was focused, and the goal was anti-Semitism, to combat anti-Semitism in university campuses. They were having negotiations with various universities. You heard about Columbia, and they had negotiations with Harvard. The problem was then the demands became, numerous and outlandish, some might say, asking for them to discontinue diversity efforts, limiting or banning student protests, that's okay, installing right-wing faculty in order to balance the number of faculty that might be left-leaning, conducting ideologic screenings of international students. And so Harvard said, no, we're not gonna do this, and publicized the letter. And that led to the administration deciding, well, we're gonna freeze, we have a lot of power, and we're going to freeze a bunch of funds, so $2.2 billion in grants. The next thing they're focused on now, because of the ongoing legal battle, is to target the tax-exempt status of Harvard, which, as you can imagine, anytime donations come into play, many of these universities depend on donations, that affects them. Many of these institutions have large endowments, and these endowments, we used to talk, we did a case study in business school about the Yale endowment and how the kind of work they did in order to increase those endowments. Those increases now become no longer are tax exempt. And so, as you can imagine, this is ongoing in the courts, and it's great that at least there's this fight, and the overall theme is keeping the fight going. Whatever you can do from your standpoint in order to keep the fight going. As Dr. Alda had talked about earlier, there's been loss of grant funding. Many of you, or some of you, have had one or two people there was either a pause or complete elimination of their grants, whether related to HIV, some places in the National Science Foundation, some community health researchers, those fundings have gone back. And like I said earlier, it's great to see that some people are fighting back. And it's left to see how this progresses. And we'll talk a little bit next about some of the responses, and we'll open it a little bit to what you guys are seeing in your areas, and an open forum of what we should do, what we can do next. Dr. Pierre?
Okay, so we've kind of briefly discussed this already, but we'll touch a little bit more on it now. So the response from most academic institutions in general to the recent DEI bans has been renaming or rebranding departments or communities. So we've seen things such as access, belonging, community engagement, focus on health equity, just kind of basically removing anything that says DEI, okay? Loss or reassignment of jobs, we've seen that at our own institutions where people's titles are stripped or their buy down has been removed, or they've been removed from the positions altogether. We're seeing elimination of DEI training for admissions and/or employment. So I think most of us in academic institutions have that typical implicit bias or cultural competency training every year. A lot of institutions, in response, maybe hasn't been said yet that it's necessary to remove it, have already started removing it just in case, because they don't want to violate any potential legal issues that their states might find within the federal funding. And then elimination of funding for DEI activities. So throughout this conference, we've had numerous discussions with people where there used to be, special graduations for people who identify or, as LGBTQIA, or people who identify as being part of a certain cultural or religious background. Funding has been stripped for those kind of activities. And this is kind of sad because if you think about it, sometimes we find our own niche within our community, our broader community as minorities. And having things like that removed preemptively, it kind of maybe can cast an idea of what that institution feels about you and what the greater department and School of Medicine feels about you and your presence at that place. So these are just some things that have happened preliminarily, but as the bans are kind of encroaching on more and more legalities, people are just doing things preemptively. So now we're going to talk about School of Medicines. So most of them have already been doing this. The AAMC has published a lot of research and articles about this as early as maybe 15 years ago about holistic review and admissions, but now more than ever that's become very important. So it's basically where you're taking away that race-based or gender-based, or if someone comes from a rural area, they don't necessarily need to put that on the application anymore, but you're gonna focus more on someone's educational background, how they grew up, if they come from a family where both parents went to college or graduate school, if their parents make over a certain amount of money, their socioeconomic background, did they come from a rural area? Are they from another country? How did they grow up? So they're placing more of an emphasis and more points on personal statements and the prompts and how people answer questions, how they do in interviews, and so forth, as opposed to having those base things based upon like race and gender or how people identify. And then also local outreach programs are becoming more important. I think most of us know that School of Medicines and institutions tend to be not necessarily underserved areas, but in areas where they have a lot of healthcare disparities. And a lot of that does tend to be based upon race, et cetera. But we can't really talk about that anymore, right? So what they're trying to do is create maybe more early pipeline programs to get physicians and students and residents in the community to show people in the community, like, this is something you can do without saying that this is race-based, but trying to hopefully curb some of those healthcare disparities by being more engaged in the community. So EM department's response to DEI bans. So what I have seen in speaking to a lot of colleagues across the country is silence is one of the biggest things, but silence also means a lot. So as we discussed earlier, people are removing websites of faculty that highlights their DEI efforts. Removing any kind of websites that have focus on the DEI activities of the department. And these things, depending on what state you're in and how much federal funding you get, including with organizations within emergency medicine, people are kind of just doing it just preemptively, just in case, because they don't want any, legal issues, period. We're seeing that a lot of people are inviting legal officers or the legal parts for the institutions to their meetings now, faculty meetings to discuss activities. We're seeing research funding, as we said, being stripped or being curtailed, or asking people to kind of cut down on their DEI activities in order to not highlight the DEI things that the university is doing or the department. And then one thing we've seen as well is that some of the departments are kind of almost breaking away from the School of Medicine and how they're operating and moving forward with the federal, the executive orders. So essentially, School of Medicines might say we're still going to continue with DEI efforts, we'll just call it something different, but EM departments are doing something different. So it's very, we're in a time of uncertainty, and a lot of people are feeling scared and not really knowing how to respond, and I've sat in some meetings and heard different chairs of different departments saying themselves, like, we don't really know what to do. We're kind of focusing on legal and how to move forward. So we have a little bit of time for an open discussion. You don't need to necessarily say your name or your institution if you want to remain anonymous. But does anyone want to talk about what their institutions or their departments are doing and how you're feeling and how they're responding? at all, we have a microphone if you guys need it. And you do not need to say your name or institution if you do not feel comfortable doing so. Yeah. Mhm. Do you want the microphone? Yeah. Okay.
I'm a former residency director at the University of Virginia. So during the time that I was leading the diversity of our program pretty significantly, thanks in part to efforts from my colleagues. I think what would be helpful for residency directors in particular is perhaps like a list of strategies that can be employed that don't run afoul of anti-DEI policies. And I think there are a lot. A lot of what we did was sort of, I don't think it would come under fire. For example, my colleague had Spanish Grand Rounds, and he presented on that yesterday. That we think was a major factor in increasing the diversity of our recruitment. So I think there are things like that. I don't know how we can organize in a way that won't attract attention, but I think residency recruitment in particular, we have the opportunity to do things that, you know, there's so much subjectivity in the process. It would be really hard for somebody to look at your rank list, for example, and say, oh, you did something illegal or against the institution's policy, although I have considered destroying my records from the 6 years of. So I think we're in a situation where people are really afraid, but I think we also have an opportunity to try to share some of these strategies. And I know sometimes historically programs don't necessarily want to share their strategies because it's a competition, but at the same time, I think it would be nice if we could organize in a way that we can say, I did X, Y, and Z, and I don't think this will run afoul of any policies.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, so thank you for your presentation, very informative. I'm Lynn Richardson. I'm from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. And there's not much that I do anonymously, so. I want to say a few things. First, I'm really disappointed that there are not more people in this room, not more people who are thinking about this issue. It's certainly consuming a great deal of my time at my institution and in organizations I belong to across the country. So here's where I think we are now. It's important to follow the law because it is, in fact, the law. We have actually had a couple of years now to deal with the anti-affirmative action decision of the Supreme Court, and I think a lot of people who did do this work have figured out how to comply with the law while continuing to do the work. I think the current administration is taking this to another level, and you touched on the fact that people now seem to be moving well beyond following the law to trying to not do anything that might upset the people who are now in power. That's very troubling to me, and if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend you look at the book by Timothy Snyder entitled On Tyranny. And it's a historical account of the rise of various fascist regimes over the last several decades. And the first principle of resistance that he points out is do not obey in advance. Do not start doing things which are still legal, which are still completely proper to do because of the environment that is being created by the administration. And so this seems to be very hard for people to do. As you said, people are sort of trying to eliminate anything that might make the current administration displeased. Even though those things are not illegal at this time, there's no reason you can't do them. Even as we await having the executive orders sort of work their way through the courts. And there's a danger to that. I hear a lot of talk in my institution and various other places that people are very worried about legal risks. They like to talk about the risks of again, doing anything that might make them stand out or quote unquote put a target on their backs and so on. They're coming for us. Doesn't really matter if you change the words on the website. So I know it's difficult. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's the lawyers, you're right now, are in every meeting where I didn't used to see lawyers, and I have a lot of respect for lawyers. They are legal experts. Their role is to give legal advice, not to make policy decisions. And I wind up making that statement a lot in meetings in my institution, because it starts with, well, the lawyers said we can't do this. And I said, did the lawyers say it was illegal? Well, no. So now they are giving advice outside of their area of expertise, right? So there are some legal decisions that need to be made, and then there are some political decisions that need to be made, and at least let people understand what they're doing. So if the lawyer said, you have to do this, the question should be, is it illegal? And if they say no, but it creates risk, okay, it's like a consultant. They give me their expert opinion. That's their job. They should tell me what the risks are, the legal risks. They should give me strategies, perhaps, to mitigate my legal risk. But when they start issuing statements about avoiding political risks, again, it's sort of an encroachment that seems very common now, and you need to call that out when you see that. So my advice is to keep asking questions. I think it's dangerous times. It's not that there aren't risks, but the risks of complying may be much more dangerous than the risks of standing up, stemming the tide, trying to do whatever you can to not obey in advance. And I think it is a time where, you're right, we need to talk to each other, connect with each other, share strategies, just affirm our commitments for those of us who still have it, because I think, unfortunately, it's going to get worse before it gets better. I'll say one final thing. There's a lot of talk about camouflage at my institution, scrubbing the websites and changing the words. I don't object to that, but there's a difference between camouflage and retreat. And you should really think about which of those is your institution or your department engaging in. Is it just, we're just doing this, to try to stay out of trouble, or are they really walking away from the values that they told us they cared about?
Thank you so much, and we're out of time. Please feel free to reach out to any of us on social media or via email to discuss this further. A lot is changing on a day-to-day basis, so we're staying up to date about it, but we'll fight the good fight. So thank you all for coming today. Appreciate it.